Hello, this is Jennifer Keller of the Westport Library. Many of us are grappling with what to read these days, especially when you can't just browse through the new releases at the library. But never fear, Sybil is here to tell us about newly published books worth your time, or those coming out soon. The Westport Library is so happy we can bring you a digital version of Sybil's list this spring. And so many of us rely on Westport's own Sybil Steinberg that we also have a resource guide viewable from the westportlibrary.org website. So you can check out the list and make your holds known to us. We have books in multiple formats at the library, and you can now pick them up curbside. So if you don't want to read them digitally, you can read the paper version. So welcome, Sybil. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer, and greetings, readers. Here we are again, but who could have imagined that we'd be meeting this way? I've been thinking back over the years when I presented my list, there's always been a glitch or two. Twice in a row, heavy rain and flooding threatened to keep people away. The parking space problem was always an issue. Then we floated around to other locations while the library was under construction. And then last year, hallelujah, we were together in the beautiful new auditorium. We had finally achieved the promised land. Let's hope that this socially distant event is a one-time thing, a short detour back to our homeland, and we'll all be back at the library next year. Meanwhile, I'd like to start with some words by A.O. Scott that I read in the New York Times the other day. He was ruminating on the job of a book reviewer, but what he said applies to all readers. He mused about some of the rituals, quote, the annotations penciled in the margin, the long silent hours spent in the exclusive company of a single imagination, the way one book leads you to another, making you privy to conversations across time and geography. I hope that some of the books I'll talk about today will serve that purpose. But first, I have a confession. This list is too long. I haven't included every book that I read since I talked to you last October, but I've chosen too many of them. However, you can slip away anytime you choose, and I won't be able to see you, so maybe this is a good thing after all. I'm starting with 3 books that I hope will make you smile. The first is This Is Happiness by Neal Williams. This charming, life-affirming novel by Irish writer Williams, who is a storyteller extraordinaire, is set in a fictional town of Faha, a remote village in County Clare, Ireland, during the spring of 1958. The 78-year-old narrator, Noel Crowe, looks back on that time when he was 17 years old, a dropout from the seminary, and sent to live with his grandparents in the tight-knit community. His grandparents are wonderfully eccentric characters, as are all the other citizens of Faha, each of whom is named in a whimsical way. This was the spring when 3 magical things happened. First, it didn't rain for 3 weeks, a miracle, since Faha is on Ireland's west coast where it rains every single day, especially in the spring. Secondly, the government finally decided that Faha could be connected via electricity, a modern convenience that wasn't welcomed by some of the thrifty villagers. And third, a stranger came to town. This stranger, a genial man called Christie, has come to atone for a cruel act in his youth for which he wants to beg forgiveness. Meanwhile, he befriends Noe, and at the same time, he teaches the younger boy to appreciate the daily, random moments of happiness that occur in every life, if we only recognize them. And importantly, Christie helps Noé to discover love through his first crush, although it is on all three daughters of the town doctor. Only an Irish writer could imagine such a sweet, gentle book in which every gorgeous sentence sings with lyric metaphors. Redhead by the Side of the Road, Ann Tyler. The only thing wrong with this immensely satisfying novel is the silly title. Otherwise, it's a delightful portrait of a traditional Tyler character, a person who lives on the verge of eccentricity. In this book, it's a man seemingly condemned to loneliness and bachelorhood who discovers in the course of one day the power of emotional connection. Nikka Mortimer, like all of Tyler's characters, lives in Baltimore. Now in his middle 30s, he has a freelance career under the name Tech Hermit, which describes his personality. He lives alone in a rigorously circumscribed routine commenced by his morning run at the same time every day, and then following an invariable schedule which is sometimes interrupted by calls from people who need his help with their computers, or the tenants of his small apartment house where he serves as super, janitor, and jack of all trades. When Mika's lady companion breaks off their relationship on the same day as a teenage boy arrives and announces himself as Mika's son, Mika's scrupulously organized life is thrown off kilter. This slim book could also be called a novella, but its short span offers a lot of reading pleasure. Nobody will tell you this but me, Bess Kalb. This is nonfiction. The author of this endearing, funny, poignant memoir about her love for and close relationship with her maternal grandmother, Bess Kalb is a writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live, and her exuberant creativity brings her grandmother to vibrant life. Grandma Bobby is a larger-than-life figure, a sort of Jewish Auntie Mame, whose advice is always filtered through family history. She takes the author to the plaza for tea, but then won't let her eat all the delicacies, citing their mutual tendency to accumulate fat around the hips. She offers advice about clothes, boyfriends, jobs, life. Despite her rise from semi-poverty in Brooklyn to the ritzier realms of Palm Beach and Martha's Vineyard, Grandma Bobby's voice never loses its rich New York cadences. Her love for the author is all-inclusive and sometimes all-enveloping, and her sassy spirit seems invincible until the inevitable and sweetly sad ending, because Grandma Bobby is dead, and her granddaughter has been channeling her voice. An interviewer asked Bess Kalb for the best advice her grandmother ever gave her, and here's the author's answer. It was the advice her own Zadie gave her. When the earth is cracking behind you, put one foot in front of the other and keep walking. I can't tell you how many times that mantra has carried me forward. And her second best advice was, if you find a lipstick that looks good on you, buy all of them, because it'll get continued and you'll never forgive yourself. Now I'd like to talk about two superlative novels that have been out for about a year, and I hope you have read. The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. The triumphant close to the historical trilogy animates the final years of Thomas Cromwell, whose achievements of power and riches were swept away when Henry VIII accused him of treason and sent him to the Tower in 1540. The book begins in 1486 when Anne Boleyn, And when Anne Boleyn never could get years straight, and her supposed lovers have just been decapitated on the false charges that Cromwell has arranged. As Cromwell continues as the king's confidant, he feels the scorn of the aristocrat whose titles he has supplanted and whose lands the king has bestowed upon him. Despite the unsavory acts with which he has carried out the king's commands, he strives for two good things: to allow the Bible to be published in English and to continue the independence of the Anglican Church from the Pope's iron will. When the king finally turns on Cromwell, the condemned man has made his mark on history. It's difficult to leave the 16th century once Mantel has led you into that world. Deacon King Kong by James McBride. A rollicking tale set in one of the poorest projects in South Brooklyn in 1969. This novel out-Dickens Dickens in the number of imaginatively named characters and the squalid conditions in which they live. The residents of the housing are mainly Black and Puerto Rican, and most of them are utterly impoverished. The center of their lives is a tiny church in which one of the deacons, named Sportcoat, has been drinking himself into oblivion for many years, courtesy of a potent brew named King Kong. Inexplicably, one day, he shoots a young drug dealer who was once the star of the baseball team that Sportcoat coached. The beginning of a convoluted plot broadens into a mystery, a crime story, but most of all, a deeply compassionate drama of valiant people trying to survive in a world that despises them. McBride keeps his narrative aloft with some of the most clever, wisecracking, irreverent, laugh out loud, funny writing that enlivens every page. When several characters suddenly find love in the most saccharine ways, it dawns upon the reader that this is at heart a fairy tale in which all ends well for the fictional characters, while the underlying message of the terrible lives Blacks in America have endured is at the same time never forgotten. These next books are recently published this month or being published between now and October. Monogamy by Sue Miller. This long-awaited, searching, tender novel by the author of the classic novel The Good Mother is a penetrating study of marriage, its intimacy, its moments of strained loneliness. Miller's keen psychological insight and her benign view of human relationships move the swiftly paced and engrossing novel to a bittersweet conclusion. Annie and Graham have both been married before. He has a son from a former marriage, and they have a daughter together. Graham is large, outgoing, generous, kind. He owns a bookstore in Cambridge that's a gathering place for many friends. Annie's photography is beginning to achieve a wider audience. Their marriage is warm and deeply loving. When Graham dies suddenly, Annie is devastated. But when a revelation gives her reason to have doubt his devotion, she is enveloped in bitterness and rage. In the most subtle and convincing way, Miller leads Annie gradually to understand that Graham's compulsively friendly personality and the generosity with which he interacted with the world sometimes led him to try to please too many people, a trait that never impinged on his sincere and ardent love for Annie. Rich characterizations of Annie and Graham of Graham's former wife and his son and their daughter are beautifully and fully dimensional. This is one of Miller's very best novels. She explained in an interview the reason it took her so many years to write this novel. Because after she had nursed her father through his final illness, she realized that she had come to know him much more deeply. So, quote, I wanted to write a book about grief and how after someone dies, we see them in a different way. And I wanted it to be within a marriage. And she has done so brilliantly. Hamnett by Maggie O'Farrell, that wonderful Irish writer. Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, died at age 11 in Stratford while his father was away in London. In this fascinating reconstruction of his short but promising life, and that of his eccentric mother, Agnes, not Anne, it was pronounced Anne, but it's close to Agnes, and his two sisters, O'Farrell delves deeply into the daily life of Warwickshire, with almost cinematic details of existence in a rural village. In alternating chapters, she goes back to 1580 when Shakespeare, then a young, penniless Latin tutor, falls in love with Agnes, a wealthy landowner's daughter who walks her family's estate with a falcon on her shoulder. She's a spinster, several years older than Shakespeare. She's also a roving botanist who collects herbs from the fields and is known for her powers of healing. So in many ways, this is Agnes's story, as she and Will marry and live with Shakespeare's parents at Henley Street in Stratford. She is a devoted and fiercely protective mother of their three children. First, Susanna, and then the twins, Hamnet and Judith. And she remains a steadfast wife when Shakespeare goes to London to further his career. O'Farrell creates a luminous portrait of a marriage and a shattering evocation of a family ravaged by grief and loss. And of course, this imaginative novel is a meditation on the circumstances that probably led to Shakespeare's superb play, Hamlet, which he wrote 4 years after his son's death. The Vanishing Half, this book by Brit Bennett, is just out within the last month. Light-skinned twin sisters live in a tiny town in Louisiana, in which all the inhabitants, descendants of a mulatta founder, are fair and blonde or redheaded. Even so, they are called colored. And the twins learn about vicious racism when their father is lynched. Determined to get away into a wider world, they run away to New Orleans when they are 16, and thereafter their lives are very different. One of them, Desiree, flouts tradition by marrying the blackest man she could find. When he becomes abusive, she flees and returns to her hometown with a daughter named Jude, a little girl so dark that she looks blue-black. The other twin, Stella, marries a white man and passes for white. She effectively disappears, realizing that she can never contact her sister or her mother again. She lives in an exclusive community in LA, always in fear of discovery. The daughter she bears and calls Kennedy is very fair-skinned, has violet eyes and blonde tresses. The contrast is implicit. One daughter is utterly black and her cousin is a blonde wasp. The reader accepts this premise because Bennett is such a talented writer and the words fly on the page. Desiree takes care of her mother and finds love with an itinerant Black man. Her dark daughter, Jude, gets a scholarship to UCLA and forges her own path in life. In a skillfully structured plot, Jude encounters her fair blonde cousin Kennedy, but it's a long time before she can reveal their relationship. Bennett invests each character with psychological depth, and she does an excellent job of demonstrating the damage of racism and the corrosive effects of secrets on individuals and families. The Vanishing Sky by Lns Binder. I have followed these books deliberately because each has the word vanishing in its title, and it's easy to get confused. So this can help you to discriminate between them. This is set in 1945 in a small rural town in Germany. It's a haunting debut novel that concerns a family caught in the horrendous damage of the Nazi regime. The father of this family is a strictly loyal Nazi patriot. The mother, on the other hand, has doubts and strives to protect their two sons from the clutches of the fanatical political regime that is racing, this is 1945, toward defeat. The elder son, who's been in the army, is sent home from the Eastern Front in a psychotic state caused by the brutality he has seen and participated in. He is incarcerated in an institution where he's been deliberately being starved to death. The younger son, a gentle adolescent, is drafted into the youth corps, where he is subjected to violence and back-breaking labor. Inspired by the author's own family history, this is a skillfully crafted account of loyalty and disillusionment, struggle and hope. It offers detailed insights into the routines of daily life during wartime and the trauma of ordinary people who were led to feel they were righteous and invincible, now realizing that the leaders they trusted were evil. Valentine, another book whose title begins with a V. I think this book is just out. It's set during the oil boom in Odessa, Texas in 1976. It's a compelling, heartbreaking, yet hopeful debut novel set in motion when a 14-year-old girl is brutally raped and abused by a roughneck from the oil fields. When Gloria Ramirez stumbles across the desert to a rancher's home, the life of the woman who opens the door will be as irrevocably changed as that of the victim herself. The men in the oil industry protect the rapist with bigotry because Gloria is Mexican, hate, and violence. It's the women in the community who pay the price of male dominance. Wetmore constructs this novel around the lives of several women who have endured lonely and stifled existences in a place where dirt, dust storms, drought, and the pervasive smell, quote, something like a gas station and a trash can full of rotten eggs, are routine events. The author spares no details of life in an area where ranchers battle drought and disease, and oil workers drink, carouse at the strip club, and behave with brutality. The novel's tension culminates in a tense court scene and then crescendos to a frenzy of life-changing moments. Wetmore delivers it all with superb pacing. Mother, Daughter, Widow, Wife. Robin Westerman. 4 women of different generations populate this ambitious novel about identity and the intersection of love and need. All of them are connected by one man, a revered scientific researcher and a brazen exploiter of women. The characters are distinctive and their lives are braided together in ways that no one could originally suspect. One character is a woman with amnesia who arrives at the famous Meadowlark Institute where she will be the subject of a research study. The graduate student researcher, who is the most recent protege of the head of the institute and adores him, is designated to probe this woman's memory. Later, there's a shocking secret about how the women are related by blood and circumstance. This is a story about memory and hidden events, about the ways women define themselves and are defined by others, about the ripple effects of buried trauma, and it is an emotionally nuanced analysis of contemporary womanhood. Want by Lynn Steger Strong. This is a young writer whom you will be hearing a lot from. Elizabeth, the narrator of this brief, funny, fierce, aching novel, is happily married to a man who dropped out of his bank career to become a master carpenter. He is now happy and content, and she is the mother of two adorable little girls. Yet she is deeply unhappy and unfulfilled of all the things, material and emotional, that she wants. Her graduate degree in literature has led to nothing except a teaching job in a New York high school and another job as an adjunct professor at a city university. Of course, she has to dash between them. Various medical problems, a cesarean delivery, and dental expenses have left the couple deeply in debt and unable to pay their rent. So they're about to declare bankruptcy. This is only the most current of Elizabeth's problems. Her deep-seated need to be wanted began in her childhood with her hard-working but remote parents who never delivered emotional warmth. And she is also guilt-ridden about the time she abandoned her longtime best friend when her friendship was desperately needed. Her self-realization comes through a crisis, and the novel builds to a profoundly moving conclusion. The Cool Millions by Jess Walter. This is a literary thriller, a top-notch literary thriller. The central focus of this swiftly paced and engrossing novel is a famous historical event that happened in Spokane, Washington in 1909. A rally called by a labor organizer that was disrupted by a police-embroiled riot is part of our civic past. I remember studying it in 8th grade social studies. The brutal treatment and arrests of the leading members of the IWW labor organization, called the Wobblies, is also factual. And the subsequent trial of 19-year-old firebrand labor agitator Elizabeth Gurley Flynn can also be found in the history books. So here, the author invents two plucky indigent brothers, Gig and Rye Dolan, who have been living as tramps, riding freight cars and sleeping in fields. They become involved in the Wobblies' cause, joining the protests against the corrupt mine owners and the compliant police who exploit and cheat people who are just trying to earn a basic living. The novel has propulsive rhythm, even as multiple characters are introduced and nefarious betrayals occur. The passionate labor activism of true-life figure suffragette Gurley Flynn is reason enough to read this novel. And the plot twists and turns accelerate the pace and highlight the central moral question. Is violence the only way that workers can acquire the rights to speak freely and earn a living wage? It's also a tender story of brotherly love and responsibility, a richly portrayed character study of men and women in different social classes, a look at the birth of the American labor movement, and a revelatory picture of life in America during the first years of the 20th century. But you'll have to wait a bit to read it because it's coming out in October. Now, the following books are available now, have been out for a couple of months, or maybe some of them half a year. The first that we'll talk about is Weather by Jenny O'Fill. Jenny O'Fill is definitely one of the most significant writers of her generation. She was the subject of a major profile in the New York Times Magazine section a few months ago as a brilliant exponent of the new genre called autofiction. Now, a word of warning from me. Do not read this book if you like novels that have a plot. Do not read this book if you like novels that have drama or suspense. Do read this book if you're willing to encounter a new kind of fiction. I loved it. This spare, slim, fiercely intelligent novel resonates beyond its specific story. It's composed of fragments of the narrator's thoughts, not stream of consciousness a la Virginia Woolf, but random blocks of text approximating both specific encounters and innermost thoughts. The narrator is Lizzie, a librarian at a British university where she was once a very promising graduate student who didn't finish her degree. She dropped out to help rescue her brother who was succumbing to drug addiction. Now she's happily married with a small son, but her brother again claims her attention as he finds he cannot cope with his own recent marriage and fatherhood. Meanwhile, Lizzie's former professor hires Lizzie to help with her famous podcast called Hell and High Water. The podcast is a clarion warning about climate change and political disaster. Soon, Lizzie is fielding existential questions about life in a universe threatened by both nature and by incompetent leaders. Lizzie's thought processes are discursive. She thinks about the strange opinions and facts that she finds online. She also interjects dark jokes, conversations with her needy Uber driver, and tender moments with her husband and her son. In other words, daily life with its frustrations and private joys. All of this is rendered without drama, but with inescapable underlying sadness and fear about the decade we're living in. These fragmented thoughts accrue with great emotional intensity. In focusing on one character whose life represents many of the challenges we all face, O'Fill has written a provocative novel. The Night Watchmen by Louise Erdrich. Louise Erdrich is a national treasure. This novel is set in her ancestral reservation, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa in North Dakota. It's a lively, funny, colorfully characterized, yet introspective narrative, and it's based on an historical event that involved Erdrich's grandfather. Her protagonist is a tribal leader named Thomas, who is chairman of his tribal advisory committee, where he tries to ameliorate the problems of the impoverished reservation. As a simple man of profound belief in ancient spirits, he is anguished when he hears, this is 1950, this is real, that a senator from Utah is presenting a bill to Congress that he claims will emancipate Native American tribes from their reservations. But in reality, the bill will abolish the treaty that promised them their sacred lands in perpetuity. So Thomas resolves to go to Washington in order to convince the Senate committee that the bill would be fatal to each struggling tribe. This richly conceived narrative weaves together the interrelated lives of a community of proud and stalwart people as they navigate both daily hardships and the larger outside forces working to destroy their fundamental way of life. Here, Erdrich again gently proclaims that there are abiding spirits in this land and alternate ways of living that have somehow survived Western society's efforts to snuff them out. Amnesty, Aravid Adiga, the Indian writer who won the Booker Prize for his novel The White Tiger, Aravind Adiga is in new territory in this affecting novel about an ordinary man who must make a crucial moral decision that might destroy all his hopes for his future. Danny, an illegal immigrant from Sri Lanka, makes his living by cleaning apartments in Sydney, Australia. Having been tortured by the police back home, he's determined to evade recognition in Australia and to settle there, hopefully winning amnesty and citizenship. When one of his clients is found murdered, Danny guesses that the killer was her lover, another client. In the course of one day, he reflects on his past and his hopes for life with his new girlfriend, while wrestling with his conscience in a state of desperate fear, because he knows that if he calls the police and identifies the killer, he himself will be deported. He questions his responsibility as a man without rights, but with a moral conscience. Adiga's wry wit enlivens the beginning of the story as he builds a portrait of Danny, book smart but naive, superstitious but clever, instinctively subversive, but wanting to belong to the society in which he is an alien. As the tone of this novel goes from humorous to suspenseful, Adiga charts Danny's movements as he moves through the various city districts of Sydney, meanwhile describing the nervous life of an undocumented immigrant who is invisible to the people around him except when he is doing manual labor. Danny becomes a character that the reader will understand and admire. Jin Patrol on the Purple Line by the Indian writer. This is also a first novel, Deepa Anapara. When children start disappearing from a squalid slum in India, 9 years old Jai pretends he is a detective. At first seen mainly from his perfectly rendered juvenile eye, the Basti community comes to life. The author vividly describes the tiny homes set next to alleys filled with refuse and filth, the public toilets for which residents stand in line, the lack of privacy, and the constant noise and squabbling. At the same time, She conveys the desperately poor but decent and honest people who work hard to raise their children and hope for a better life. But corruption surrounds them. The police are disdainful and actively ask for bribes, but do nothing to protect the community. As more children disappear, terror takes hold in the slum. This is brilliantly conveyed through Jai's thoughts and fears. When finally his own sister disappears, the book reaches a heartbreaking conclusion. This novel is not easy to read, but it's important and unforgettable. Run Me to Earth by Paul Yoon. Paul Yoon, by the way, is a poet who has written several wonderful books of poetry. But here, this book is fiction. First, to give you an historical note about the history that backgrounds this novel. During our secret war in Laos in the 1960s, the United States conducted aerial bombing missions all over that country. These missions would last 9 years, from 1964 to 1973, and would end up totaling more than 580,000 bombardments. This is the equivalent of one bombardment every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. Many of these bombs failed to explode on impact, creating minefields ready to detonate when anyone rode or walked among them. In this aching, haunting novel, 3 teenage orphans try to survive the bombings and not starve to death. In return for food and shelter, they become motorcycle couriers, engaging in highly dangerous missions to deliver medicine and supplies to a derelict mansion that has been turned into a field hospital. They spend grueling days searching for survivors in the minefields, and then even acting as nurses in the understaffed hospital. As the war closes in, a kind doctor tries to secure their evacuation on one of the last helicopters leaving the country. Paul Yoon has written an exquisite, elegant novel that transcends its cruel subject to become an unforgettable story about courage and endurance. Writers and Lovers by Lily King. King wrote Euphoria, the novel about Margaret Mead. And this is a charming, funny, captivating book about the human need for connection, for love, and for creative identity. Casey Peabody is 31 years old. She is broke, saddled with enormous student debt, and reeling from her beloved mother's recent sudden death. All she wants now is to continue working on her novel. Writing feeds a hunger in her. She must write. But now, in the book, it's 1997, she is blocked and frightened. She also needs to come to terms with her mother's absence and to work through memories from her childhood. After several bad breakups from relationships, she also hopes to find a man she can love. And there is also the practical need to pay the rent that keeps her working as a waitress in an upscale restaurant in Harvard Square. When suddenly 2 new men arrive in her life, one, a famous novelist, widowed, with 2 adorable young boys, and the other, an aspiring writer who seems skittish and reluctant to return Casey's sexual attraction, things begin to get worse instead of better. But trust me, everything works out. Overarching the plot, this is a story about the making of art. King offers insight about inspiration and creation, the toll they exact, and the exaltation they provide. And as I say, this is a life-affirming novel. The Long Petal of the Sea by Isabel Allende. This is one of the best of Allende's books in recent years. It's set initially during the Spanish Civil War, and Allende's gripping account has visceral immediacy, colored with specific details of horror and suffering, but presented without melodrama. When Franco's fascist forces, aided by German and Italian bombers, finally subdue the Republican uprising in Barcelona, Franco promises bloody revenge on the decimated, starving population. A mass exodus of Barcelona's survivors begins. Quote, a Dantesque spectacle of thousands of refugees shivering with cold and close to starvation. Once over the border into France, they are herded into tents on a cold beach where their suffering is intensified. The hero of this novel is Victor, a young doctor who flees those camps in France with a young woman who is carrying his dead brother's child. The ship that takes them to Chile has been chartered by the poet Pablo Neruda, then at that time working as a Chilean diplomat. In Chile, Victor becomes a friend of Salvatore Allende, the president of Chile, and he has a thriving career, later halted by the military coup led by Pinochet. This is an absorbing narrative that illuminates historical events in both Spain and Chile. It's a testament to those who suffered in Spain and then embraced hardships as they escaped Franco's retribution. Afterlife, Julia Alvarez, another Latina writer, the narrator of this poignant, funny, resonant novel, is one of four sisters who immigrated from the Dominican Republic in 1960. Antonia is a recent widow trying to find hope in an altered life, having just retired from her career as a professor in a Vermont college. Her three sisters are scattered across the United States, but they stay in constant contact. Antonia needs time to absorb her grief. But when one of her sisters disappears, she and her other siblings begin an anguished search. Meanwhile, she has been approached by a young laborer, a young man who works on a nearby farm, and she has reluctantly agreed to shelter his girlfriend, an undocumented Mexican teenager who is pregnant and who is in danger of deportation. Though desperate for privacy and detachment, Antonia wonders, how much does she owe other people at the expense of her own emotional equilibrium? This narrative of loss and love, of family devotion in the midst of societal upheaval and political turmoil, is heartfelt and moving. My Dark Vanessa, this is a dark novel indeed. Kate Elizabeth Russell. This literary page turner might leave a queasy memory. The narrator describes her seduction by a teacher in her elite boarding school and its continuing emotional damage in her life. Vanessa Y. is 14 years old when her 42-year-old English professor, Jacob Strayed, seduces her. Because she is so young and impressionable, she is totally enthralled. Afterwards, he insists that she was the aggressor, that she made herself seductive and available. Mesmerized by his declared devotion, Vanessa allows herself to take the fall when their affair is outed. She is expelled from the school for devious and morally dishonest behavior, but he is allowed to remain there despite clear evidence that he is a predator of young girls. In a remarkable tour de force, Russell portrays the guilty emotions instilled in Vanessa by her lover and his continuing control over her life through adolescence and young womanhood. While this is a harrowing book to read, it's also a significant description of what seems, on latest evidence, and there will be a memoir in the fall that I will talk about, to be an unchecked danger to susceptible teenagers in the nation's boarding schools. Rodham, a familiar name, by Curtis Sittenfeld. Politically savvy, empathetic, and clever, Sittenfeld's take on the life that Hilary might have led if she hadn't married Bill is angry, funny, and tender. As she dramatizes the sexism that confronted Hilary at every turn and the sacrifices that an eventual president, Rodham, would have had to make, Sittenfeld's consistently entertaining novel recognizes the flaws in Hilary's public personality and the contradictions in her character. This richly imagined alternate history raises provocative questions about the obstacles facing all female political figures in our patriarchal political system. As she imagines the inner life of the woman we think we know so well, she creates an appealing and plausible life story, constrained by the societal and political mores of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The book is a wise consideration of the sacrifices American women must make in pursuit of political power. Three Daughters of Eve by Elif Shafak, a Turkish writer. In this book, faith and doubt, feminism, secularism, and identity are the issues considered in this deeply intelligent novel of ideas. Shafak raises these provocative questions largely in flashback as her heroine, Perry, leaves Turkey in the late 1990s to study at Oxford. These experiences of her youth in Oxford alternate with description of Perry's turbulent day in contemporary Istanbul, where she is mugged and thwarts a waitress on her way to a dinner party at the seaside mansion of a rich businessman. Discussion at the party navigates the simmering tensions between East and West, between religious and secular beliefs, between rich and poor. Perry is moved to recall a traumatic time in Oxford that ended in a scandal involving her and a professor with whom she was in love. The end of the novel, when the dinner party is invaded by terrorists, bring these two strands of her life together. Altogether interesting novel. The Glass Hotel, Emily St. John, Mandel. This strange and challenging novel, composed of interlaced fragments, begins when a woman is swept overboard from a freighter during a storm at sea. The woman, we soon found out, is named Vincent, and Vincent is beautiful and talented and doomed. This is the first of many fascinating twists on reality that Mandel handles with virtuosity in a novel that veers backwards and forwards in time, from settings in Vancouver Island to the art scene in New York, and from scenes of startling realism to mysterious supernatural appearances. Mandel is a writer of prodigious gifts. Her sentences resonate with beautiful cadences, and her characters are vividly alive. Chief among them is a charming financial manipulator whose audacious Ponzi scheme is brilliant until it isn't. The analogy to Bernie Madoff is intentional. If the plot takes some effort to fathom, the narrative exerts a powerful hold on the reader's imagination. As I say, a little tough to follow the plot, but then it coalesces. The next book of V by Anna Solomon, two women of different generation find their lives are relevant to a third, the biblical character of Esther, wife of the Persian king Ahasuerus, who saved her tribe of Hebrews from extermination. This ambitious and intriguing novel first explores Esther's reluctant marriage to the king in Persia. These chapters alternate with the story of a woman who lives in Washington, D.C. during the 1960s and who abruptly leaves her politically ambitious husband when he commands her to sexually amuse a crowd of his supporters. The third woman lives in contemporary Brooklyn, where she is grappling with her sexual and intellectual desires as she raises two children among the boring demands of domesticity. Solomon connects these three lives in surprising ways, saving a satisfying secret that ties all the plot strands together at the end. Beheld, Kara Shea Nesbitt. This is a fascinating revisionist version of early American history. It begins quietly and grows in impact. In 1630, in Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, was seething with animosity, hatred, hypocrisy, and class prejudice. The strict religious beliefs that had sent the Mayflower Pilgrims to America had been transported here virtually intact and were administered with an iron fist. But along with the Puritans who practiced their fundamentalist faith, there were many indentured servants who espoused the less rigorous Anglican faith. In fact, and I hadn't known this till I read it here, when the ship that the Puritans had planned to take to these shores proved to be unseaworthy, they were crammed into the Mayflower along with the many non-Puritan passengers who were already on board. The novel centers on the non-Puritan Billington family. They are now free of their contract as servants after 7 years of servitude, but they are still shunned by the Puritan community. When a promised gift of land is withheld from John Billington, his anger leads him to a fatal act, the first murder in the colony. There was a murder in the colony. Billington had been outspoken in his criticism of the colony's rules and rulers, calling the colonists hypocrites in their abuse of power under the cloak of sanctity. Nesbitt portrays such historical figures as William Bradford, the ultra pious governor, and Miles Standish, the nasty, diminutive soldier dubbed by everyone the Shrimp. But her main contribution is she vividly evokes the social and psychological climate in Plymouth. And she tells the story via the voices of several women who were submerged in dutiful submission to their husbands. This is a compelling, fresh look at our received history. Simon the Fiddler, another historical novel by Paulette Giles. A character from News of the World makes a brief appearance in another of Giles's novels set in the South after the Civil War. And again, she describes the chaotic reality of the Reconstruction era, where lawlessness and violence were still facts of daily life. The eponymous protagonist is Simon Boudin, age 23, who has so far evaded military duty, but now, unluckily, is belatedly conscripted into the Confederate Army. Luckily, his talent with a fiddle and his meeting with 3 other lost souls who play musical instruments results in a series of adventures as Simon and his bandmates travel around Texas in search of a livelihood. The narrative is suffused with the music the band plays, folk songs and waltzes from the early years of our country's history. Simon has another obsession and destination. He's determined to find and wed a beautiful Irish indentured servant named Doris, whom he had glimpsed as his band played an event that included a Union colonel to whose daughter Doris is a governess. Giles goes a bit overboard with sentimentality as Simon idolizes Doris from afar. And his various adventures as he pursues Doris do not have as much suspense as readers might wish, but it all leads to a satisfying conclusion, and this is, of course, a charming book. A Thousand Moons by Sebastian Barry, another historical novel set after the Civil War. Winona, the Lakota Indian girl adopted by John Cole and Thomas McNulty in Days Without End, is the narrator of this moving sequel to that book. They all live and work on a farm in Tennessee. Tennessee, however, is a state still embroiled in the after effects of the Civil War and Reconstruction. They're having a peaceful, if hard-working existence, but their tranquility is disturbed when a local young man decides he wants to marry Winona. This makes her nervous in ways she can't explain. Winona is trying to reconcile the memories of her Native American heritage with the code of the white world in which she now lives. She has suppressed the memories of the Army massacre in which her family and all of her tribe were killed. But glimmers of that bloody time still invade her dreams. A kind lawyer employs her as his clerk and adds to her education, and a compassionate Black woman and her artistically talented brother, who also live on the farm, make her emotionally comfortable. But when a series of violent events occur, a rape, a brutal attack by former Confederate soldiers known as Night Riders, the forefront of the Ku Klux Klan. Winona is subjected to the hatred of some of the villagers as well. This is when the narrative picks up pace and moves quickly to several revelations. Barry's lyrical prose is perfectly adapted to the words of a young girl learning to love language and embrace life. How much of this hill is gold? by Si Peng Zhang. This extraordinary debut novel is the haunting tale of two siblings set adrift in the American West during the Gold Rush. Lucy is 12, Sam is 11. They are two of the few Chinese people in the village, and the family has been forced to live on its outskirts in a hovel as their father toiled in the silver mines. Their mother has disappeared, and after their father dies in their tiny shed, they must survive on their own. They're desperate to leave the mining country and somehow find shelter elsewhere. As she describes their dangerous journey, Zhang's narrative voice is sheer poetry, even in descriptions of harrowing events. The beauty of the landscape that the siblings travel, as well as its deadly dangers, is almost cinematically rendered. The novel blends Chinese symbolism and myth with the sights and sounds of a dangerous world in which swirling dust, a scouring wind, pelting rain, a jackal's howls, and a dead body's travels combine to immerse the reader in a compulsively suspenseful narrative. This is a story about family, about the immigrant experience, about racism, about yearning for a home, about hope and loss, hate and injustice, about desperation and courage and the cost of survival. It's brilliantly imagined and gorgeously written. An elegant woman, Martha Mcphee. Martha Mcphee is one of, I think, 5 daughters of John Mcphee, that wonderful nonfiction writer. This is drawn from her own family's history. It's a multi-generational saga in which the protagonist is the narrator's grandmother. It begins in Ohio in 1910 when Thelma, nicknamed Tommy, is almost 6 years old, and her little sister, Catherine, who's 4, are both abducted, just stolen out in the middle of the night, abducted from their comfortable home by their free-spirited mother who wants to live an exciting and fulfilling life, and Ohio is too straight-laced for her. The 3 of them, after an arduous train trip, eventually wind up in Butte, Montana. There, their mother leaves the girls alone to fend for themselves while she travels around the state seeking jobs as a school teacher. So Tommy takes care of her little sister. She learns how to trap animals for food, and she makes sure that Catherine goes to school. There's only one pair of shoes, and Catherine gets it. When Catherine graduates from high school, Tommy makes a decision that changes the course of both their lives. Later, when she is married and a wealthy matron, now she is Grammy, she tells her 4 granddaughters the story of her tumultuous life. Her fabrications enhance her true stories of life on the Western frontier. And this book is out this month. It's out in June. Transcendent Kingdom. This may not be out yet. I think it was postponed until October after I put it on this list. At any rate, Yaya Gyasi wrote a stunning first novel, Homegoing, which I really recommend. It was set in her native Ghana, where the traditional rivalry between the Fantes and the Asante tribes was described with historical accuracy. The heroine of this book is a young woman whose parents emigrated from Ghana to Huntsville, Alabama, where Gifty, the narrator, grew up. Now she is a doctoral candidate in neuroscience at Stanford. But she's been emotionally scarred by her father's abandonment. He left his wife and children and returned to Ghana. And by the death of her very talented brother from a drug overdose. And now by her suicidal mother's deep depression. While her experiments with mice in the lab are an attempt to find the scientific explanation for her family's loss, she finds herself hungering for the comfort of her childhood faith in the evangelical church in which she was raised. This is a novel about faith and science from the point of view of an immigrant family based in an alien culture. It's also an intimate portrait of a young woman dealing with tragic loss and finding, through the language of existential questions, the enriched life to go on. Actress by Anne Enright, who is a wonderful Irish author. This ranges in setting from Dublin to Broadway to Hollywood. And Enright's new novel is an acutely insightful mother-daughter story. Nora O'Dell's mother, Catherine, is a brilliant theater legend with a transatlantic career, but she's been a needy and evasive parent, too self-absorbed to function fully as a maternal figure. Nora, who is now middle-aged, conjures up scenes from her mother's life. Some of it was triumphal, some was miserable, and she intersposed these with scenes from her own sexual and emotional coming of age. In reprising her mother's life, Nora realizes how men influenced, controlled, and virtually ended Catherine's career. Yet Nora holds no resentment of the difficulties of her own upbringing, and she so shows a fine understanding of the dark side of celebrity stardom. This next is another fine character study by a British writer, Graham Swift. Here we are. This is set in Brighton, England in 1959. It's a brief, touching novel around a lover's triangle. Jack, the master of ceremonies of a slightly tawdry variety show at the end of Brighton's famous pier, enlists his erstwhile friend Ronnie, a budding magician, and his assistant and fiancée, Evie, to do a show with him. And this is a highly atmospheric recreation of a specific time in British history. With descriptions of the entertainers' lives, they are always on the threshold of fame or ruin. Flashbacks to the war years evoke each character's path as events unfold that will have lasting consequences to these three stalwart friends whose relationships are overturned by love. And Love is the title of Roddy Doyle's most recent novel. During one long night and in and out of dozens of Dublin pubs, two men, Joe and Davy, once boyhood friends, confess to each other what has happened to their lives. This is a very talky novel, made up mainly of short, terse dialogue, heavy with Irish vernacular, and most of it profane. 35 years ago, when they were young, both men fell in love with a beautiful woman named Jessica, who played her cello in their favorite pub. But later, each of them married other women and had children. Now, Joe has re-encountered Jessica, and he's trying to explain to Davy why he has left his wife, whom he still loves, and his children, to move in with Jessica. The only reason he can give is that he feels he is finally living his real life, the life he was meant to live, the love he was meant to have. Now, Davy keeps looking at his watch, not revealing that he's waiting for a call from the hospice where his father lies dying. In the course of this headlong conversation, punctuated by liberal amounts of beer, both men admit to jealousy, guilt, and resentment. Both feel a sense of betrayal, but both rekindle the bonds of friendship. This novel is not easy to read because of the Irish vernacular. And one character says, "I loved speaking like a Dubliner. It felt like physical exercise." The reader may feel the same way about the effort it takes, but trust me, it's worth it in the end. I grouped the next 3 books that share common themes. To the Edge of Sorrow by Ron Appelfeld. The esteemed Israeli writer who died in 2019 again addresses the tragic lives of those caught in the Holocaust. Here, he depicts a group of Jewish partisans hiding in Ukrainian swamps and forests, enduring hardship, hunger, freezing weather, emotional torment, and danger, enduring it all with heroic bravery. They are a ragtag group of young men of diverse backgrounds, from university graduates to humble workers. There are 2 women, one the cook who achieves nourishing meals from few supplies, the other a nearly ancient grandmother who supplies spiritual nourishment. A young boy and a mute toddler are also protected within this group. The leader is a prophetic man called Camille, and he leads his troops in raids to find food, and then even more dangerous expeditions to dynamite the trains carrying Jews to Auschwitz, so they won't get to Auschwitz. Meanwhile, the men engage in intense discussions about religion and the meaning of life. As in his previous novels, Appelfeld's direct, understated descriptions of daily life add credence and urgency to his work. The Parisian, published last year to rave reviews, and I didn't get around to it till now, and I'm grateful. This is a beautifully written novel that could bring a reassessment to a reader's views of the current turmoil in the Middle East. Begins in the World War I years. The narrative follows a young Palestinian man, the son of a wealthy merchant, as he leaves Nablus in Ottoman Palestine. This is when Palestine was governed by the Turks. He leaves to study medicine in Montpellier, France. There, he falls in love with the daughter of a doctor in whose home he is a lodger. But then, in the wake of a devastating revelation, he flees to Paris. And later, when he returns home to Nablus, he is called by his fellow Nablus citizens. From then on, he is called the Parisian. But there he witnesses the tragic events in which Palestinian nationalists who opposed the Zionist settlers protected under the British mandate were crushed and destroyed. Readers unfamiliar with the historical situation in the Levant will find this story provocative. The protagonist, his family, and his friends are part of a culturally rich, economically thriving society, doomed to be destroyed when the winds of change brought the state of Israel, and seething nationalism eventually gave birth to El Fatah and terrorism. In addition to being written with uncommon elegance, insight, and poignancy, this is a riveting look at a society that succumbed to the twist of history. And history again, in that same world, a Pyrogon, Colin McCann. Two fathers, one Israeli, the other Palestinian, who have lost their daughters to terrorists and military violence, are the protagonists of McCann's quasi-novel. It is some fiction and some nonfiction. In 1,000 short chapters meant to echo the Arabian Nights, McCann merges his imagination with historical fact. Empathetic to both fathers and seriously aware of the complex ironies of this seemingly intractable situation, he describes the father's real-life decisions to form a group called Combatants for Peace and their activities as they go around the world speaking and sharing their hopes for a peaceful solution to the conflict that divides their mutual homeland. McCann deserves credit for dramatizing an important issue, but I felt the pastiche of various fiction and nonfiction passages dilutes the impact of this otherwise significant piece of work. We're kind of in the same strain of history, but going further back in this next novel by Stefan Hertzmans. Years ago, I recommended his wonderful book, War and Turpentine, so I couldn't wait to read this one. This uses historical detective work to weave together fact and fiction, again, like the preceding book, to tell this tragic story of a remarkable woman buffeted by the tides of religious extremism in medieval Europe. In Rouen, in 1087, a young noblewoman named Vigdis Adelais falls in love with David Todros, a Jewish student in a yeshiva there. He is the son of a renowned rabbi of Narbonne. They fall in love. They run away together. This happened. This is historical. Pursued by Vigdis's father and his knights. Vigdis converts to Judaism to marry David, and they have 3 children and live quietly in the Provençal mountain town of Monnier. But in 1091, the First Crusade begins. Eventually, the marauding knights perpetrate a massacre that destroys much of the Jewish quarter of Monnier. David is killed, and 2 of her children are pulled out of Vigdis's arms by a soldier. She escapes after much suffering with her baby son. She thinks she will find her lost children if she follows the Crusaders to Jerusalem. The author, who himself lives in the village of Monnier, painstakingly reconstructs her journey. The next 2 books are about women finding out who they are in the midst of lives that are disrupted. Salt's Water. A young woman is caught between the legacy of a working class upbringing in northern England, Yorkshire, and the disdain she felt from her posh, privileged classmates when she studied at a British university. She has now graduated, left London, and is living briefly, she hopes, in a stone cottage on the coast of Ireland, which has been left to her and to her mother in a legacy from her grandfather. Her mother is now at the cottage as well, helping to clean out decades of filth and creating bonfires where they hope to burn the remnants of an estrangement between them, which has not fully healed. The narrative becomes Lucy's coming-of-age story as she reflects on the tensions in her family arising from the behavior of her charming, broken, alcoholic grandfather and echoing in her father's alcoholic traits as well. She cannot understand how women, including her mother, continue to suffer in marriages to unreliable, often violent men. And she determines to sift through the events of her childhood to help her understand her own place in a transformed society. The Island Child by Molly Aitken. This is a beautifully written and visually evocative debut novel, also set initially in Ireland, this on a tiny island off the west coast. Una, the daughter of a religiously obsessed, Bible-quoting and viciously cruel mother, has always determined that she will leave the island one day. Her wishes are fulfilled in a tragic way after a violent event at an annual island festival. She escapes by suddenly marrying a man she does not know, and she goes with him to his hometown in Canada to begin a new and difficult life. 20 years later, after bearing 2 children and losing one, Una is confronted with the secrets of her past when her daughter, a college student in New York, vanishes, and her path leads back to Ireland and to Una's mother. Aitken's lyrical prose sings with Irish cadences, even while describing the brutal and backbreaking work of the islanders, where the men confront danger every day as fishermen, and their wives do the exhausting work of raising children in a barren and primitive land. Her portraits of the islanders are realistic, evoking a closed-in society where life never changes. Northernmost, another community where most of us had never been. 2 branches of the same Norwegian and Norwegian American family are linked here in a dual narrative in which old secrets come to light. If you want to hear me, you'll bear with a little throat clearing. The central event is the amazing adventure of a simple fisherman from a tiny town in Norway who, in the 1800s, while involved in a hunting expedition in the Arctic, manages to survive a harrowing event. After his companion is killed by a bear, there are only 2 of them on this event, a man called Odd, O-D-D, spends 2 weeks alone on a glacier. He is lost, snowblind, starving, and hunted by that same bear. His survival is a miracle, and he returns to his bleak village. On the day, his wife is preparing a funeral service for him. Together, they continue to mourn another loss, a previous loss. Their beloved daughter had embarked to join relatives in Minnesota when she was 18. and she was never heard from again. In alternate chapters, the novel then follows a contemporary woman, the great-great-granddaughter of that young woman, who is drawn to her ancestral village in Norway as she contemplates the end of her marriage. The achievement of this novel is to present both the Arctic landscape and life in rural Minnesota with a clarity and honesty of detail that are exceptionally powerful. Now, Miss Iceland, Odur Ava Olafsdottir. This odd but charming and tender novel by a prize-winning Icelandic writer is steeped in the geography, history, and culture of Iceland and the national characteristics of its people. In 1960, Iceland has more writers per capita than anywhere else in the world. Most of them are poets, and all of them are men. Hekla, whose father has named her after a volcano, wants to be a novelist. But the odds against a female writer getting her work published are enormous. So she leaves her family's sheep farm and goes to Reykjavik, where she moves in with her gay friend John. He wants to be a costume designer. Both of them are working at menial jobs with the hopes of leaving for what they call abroad, where freedom from convention beckons. So they get themselves to Denmark, where they hope society will offer them more opportunities of love and of fulfilling careers. Olafsdottir writes feelingly about the compulsion to create, about a gay man's heartache, about devoted female friendship, and the rare radiance of human kindness. This short, terse novel becomes unexpectedly moving. Abigail, Magda Szabo. This is a classic novel in Hungary since it was written in 1970. It has been newly translated into English. It's the story of a 14-year-old girl who comes of age during World War II. It's by turns funny and sad and increasingly suspenseful and psychologically keen. Gina is the headstrong daughter of a general in the Hungarian army. Her sophisticated life in Budapest is brought to a sudden end when her beloved father sends her inexplicably to a draconian, arch-conservative religious boarding school way out in the country. Furious about her exile, Gina earns the hatred of her classmates by betraying an important secret. And afterwards, they are implacable in ostracizing her. So with nothing to lose, she confides her unhappiness in a note she leaves at a statue of a woman in the garden. The statue is called by her classmates Abigail. Soon, she receives letters of encouragement, ostensibly from the statue Abigail. When she decides to run away, because she is still so ostracized, she sets in motion a chain of events that reveals the identity of Abigail, while demonstrating the peril that Gina is in as a result of her father's secret rebellion against the Nazi-allied Hungarian government. Her life changed in a dramatic way. Gina, at the end, has learned about trust and betrayal, but mainly about compassion and loyalty. 2 volumes of short stories among several I have read A Registry of My Passage Upon the Earth, Daniel Mason. He wrote Soldier in Winter, which I really love. 9 stories demonstrate the author's astonishingly fertile imagination, his mastery of writing styles, historical settings, and metaphysical questioning. In one story, a desperate mother is determined to save her asthmatic son's life in smoke and grit-filled London. In another, a man becomes an obsessive collector of scientific specimens of exotic plants. And then there is a fable-like account of a pharaoh in ancient Egypt whose longing for knowledge is never quelled. The title story is narrated by a man who believes that God has directed his quest to name and record everything on the earth. A sense of wonder is common to all these stories, each of which holds an arresting epiphany. Maggie Brown and Other Stories, Peter Orner. Orner's distinctive voice and narrative style are like no other writer's. I admire his work so much. These 36 stories range from one-pagers to one that's the length of a novella. Regretful insights, desperate determination, and moments of heartbreak inhabit Orner's characters' inner lives. Most of these characters live in the dying town of Fall River, Massachusetts. They are an ingrown, interlocked social and cultural group, united by the religion most of them have abandoned and by their memories of the economic heyday they enjoyed before I-95 slowly strangled business and community solidarity. Now, finally, nonfiction. Hidden Valley Road by Robert Coker. Of all the books I have read this year, this is the one that has made the greatest impression on me. It's an extraordinary piece of writing, a page turner, and a reading experience that is unforgettable. As a chronicle of a family cursed with schizophrenia, it unfolds with the velocity and suspense of a thriller. Coker's superb reporting skills and his literary gifts make this an amazing example of narrative nonfiction. Dan and Mimi Galvin, an upper middle class, sophisticated, and highly intelligent couple living in Colorado in the 1960s and 1970s, had 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls. Of the 10 boys, 6 gradually became victims of the disease that baffled everyone, especially as seen in such a prolific form in one family. Their obsessive and violent behavior took its toll on the other members of the family. The details of each specific young man's breakdown are tragic. The family dynamic, a perfectionist mother and remote father, plus their initial denial and need to pretend nothing was wrong, contributed to a melange of traumas for everyone. Coker interweaves this family story with the intriguing details of the scientific research which has yet to find the clue to this mysterious and acutely painful disease. His descriptions of several decades of neurological research only contribute to the suspense that this book maintains. His gripping account of the toll of mental illness on individuals and family relationships reads like Greek tragedy. Fiction could not do justice to this intriguing story. American Rebels by Nina Sankovich. I'm thinking some of you have already read this book, and I am happy to praise it, by Westport's distinguished writer. It's subtitled How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. This assiduously researched book holds fascinating information about the early years of our country. Sankovich explores these three families from their common origins in Braintree, Massachusetts, and she shows how the revolutionary spirit slowly developed in each of them. The biggest surprise to me was learning about the Quincy family, specifically Josiah Quincy Jr., a brilliant man supremely dedicated to his new country, who spent the final year of his young life in England trying to convince Parliament to deal fairly with the colonies. But before that, each of these men, plus a brave and sensible Abigail Adams, sincerely hoped to avoid separation from England. This shows step by step the events that led irrevocably to revolution. Another surprise for me was to learn the extent that class differences still mattered in this new world. John Adams, who came from farm stock, always felt inferior to John Hancock, whose family amassed wealth in trade and real estate, and especially to Josiah Quincy, whose family represented old stock and old money. So one prime reason to read this book is to become acquainted with the Quincy's, father and son, and other members of their family who had divided loyalties. While it deals with the facts of history, the book also holds high drama, as it eloquently presents the philosophical and pragmatic ideals that imbued each patriot with vivid life. The Splendid and the Vile, Erik Larson. Even readers who think they know everything about Winston Churchill will enjoy this focus on the epical year in which he effectively saved Western civilization. The time span is exactly 1 year. From May 1940, the first year that Churchill was Prime Minister of England, to exactly 1 year later, after he had led his nation through the horrors of the Blitz. At first, this book is chatty and anecdotal, with short chapters that alternate between the Churchill family's intimate domestic dramas and excerpts from various diaries. Larson also turns his gaze on Hitler's cabinet, and using archival documents, he portrays the events that gave the Nazis what was originally superior war power to the vastly unprepared British military. Soon dramatic tension builds, both in describing Churchill's heroic micromanagement of his government, and then in riveting details of the Blitz, the horrendous bombing raid that almost destroyed London and almost obliterated other British cities. The sheer volume of the death and destruction of that terrible year, countered by the courage of the British people, makes this a page turner. And it's also a timely reminder of how great leadership can save a country and its people. Love in the Blitz, this is, I think, out this month. Eileen Alexander is the writer. It's a voluminous cache of letters written by this brilliant young woman, Eileen Alexander, to her fiancé during World War II. It's both the story of a passionate love affair and an historically important account of a certain segment of British society. Eileen Alexander earned a first at Cambridge, where she fell in love with another Cambridge student, Gershon Ellenbogen. Despite a class difference clearly revealed in Eileen's letters, the romance flourished, even through 4 brutal years while the Blitz destroyed London. Eileen, during this time, worked for the Air Ministry, but Gershon was stationed in Egypt. Eileen's mother was a member of the fabulous wealthy Mosseri family, whose banking interests in Cairo and Italy were the source of the family fortune. Her father was an esteemed lawyer who worked for the British government in various wartime capacities. They were, to themselves, a certain segment of Jewish aristocracy. So this is an extraordinary personal look at them and a revealing portrait of Eileen herself as she matures during the years of conflict and remains passionately in love with her faraway soldier. Our Revolution, Honor Moore, might be out this month. In her previous memoir, The Bishop's Daughter, Moore wrote about her famous father, the beloved Bishop of New York, who revitalized St. John the Divine with his leadership on civil rights and justice for the poor. Her book also revealed her father's secret life as a homosexual, even as he fathered 9 children. Here, the subject is her mother, the product of a wealthy, privileged background, who joined her husband in his campaign for social justice, who chose to live with him in slum housing among his poor, often Black and marginal parishioners. This was early in the marriage, while mothering her children and conducting all the duties of a priest's wife. Honor, as the eldest of the children, incurred responsibilities that her mother couldn't manage, and as a result, she's honest about her resentment. But when all the children were out of the house, finally, Jenny Moore began to live her own life, inspired by Betty Friedan and other feminists. She wrote a best-selling book about her experiences living in the Black community. And she had the courage to separate from her husband. And she was at work on another book when she was diagnosed with cancer at age 50. Everything was just starting, she said, when her health started its terminal decline. Moore's memoir of her mother evolves beautifully into a narrative about the sweeping changes in women's lives that began to occur in the 20th century. The Man in the Red Coat, Julian Barnes, here writing nonfiction, set in Belle Epoque Paris. This is a witty study of the aristocratic, literary, intellectual, and artistic major players of the Gilded Age. It centers around a man who is none of the above, but who moved within their purviews with ease. Samuel Posey was a renowned society doctor and a pioneering surgeon whose intelligence, charm, handsome appearance, and money, he married it, allowed him to move with the outstanding social and cultural leaders of the time. His portrait by John Singer Sargent gives the book its title and its cover. But Barnes here concentrates equally on 2 of Posey's aristocratic friends, Count Robert de Montesquieu and Prince Edmond de Polignac. He also describes the jealousy, competitiveness, backbiting, slander, prejudice, and other traits that characterized many relationships among the leading figures of society of the time. Among the minor players in this rich account are Sarah Bernhardt, Henry James, Oscar Wilde, Marcel Proust, and James Whistler. This is an odd book, more discursive than focused, but it offers intriguing sidelights to history. The next two books, I think, portray my interest in certain books of Jewish history. When I joined Publishers Weekly in 1976, I became the reviewers of all the books about the Holocaust, fiction and nonfiction. So I think perhaps my reading bears the imprint of that particular interest, which I cannot shed. I continue to find books about this period of history that intrigue me. Okay, Tehran Children. This is the amazing and little-known story of the hundreds of Jewish children who had been part of an arduous 1,000-mile journey from Europe to Tehran during World War II. The author's father was one of those children whose ordeal began in Soviet-occupied Poland, where over 1 million Jews fled from the Polish part. They fled from the Nazis who were in the Polish part to the Soviet part, thinking that they'd be safer there because of the treaty between Hitler and Stalin. But instead of finding safe harbor, they were deported to gulags in the Soviet interior. They suffered extreme deprivation and forced labor. Even the little children were sent out to back-breaking work in freezing weather. Then they were dispersed to the 5 Soviet Muslim republics of Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, in the middle of a terrible famine there. So eventually, some were lucky enough to be designated to join a bedraggled group of Jewish and non-Jewish children who finally reached Tehran, where they were welcomed by the Jewish community and then sent on to Palestine, which was still a British mandate at that time. This is meticulous analysis, both an eye-opening history and an intimate memoir. Last page, Return to the Reich. Fred Mayer and his family escaped Nazi Germany and came to the United States just in time in 1938. He grew up in Brooklyn, and when America entered the war, he was eager to enlist in the Army. He was recruited to the fledgling OSS, and he was parachuted behind enemy lines into Austria, posing as a Nazi officer. He was with 2 other men, one an American Jew born in the Netherlands, and the other a deserter from the German army itself. The 3 of them carried out a series of secret espionage missions that supplied the Allies with crucial information that helped the war. And Lichtblau's account is a fine piece of historical journalism that clearly reveals Meyer's bravery and heroism. I hasten to say that you are heroic if you have reached the end of this long talk without falling asleep or finding yourself in need of a candy bar. I think I will reach for a candy bar myself now and thank everyone who tuned in and listened.
Thank you, Sybil. And if you have made it to the end, kudos. That's a lot of reading to do, Sybil. Thank you so much. Remember, you can take out books from the library. You can get them through your favorite retailer. So happy reading.